Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Nathaniel Rich is the author of the novels King Zeno, Odds Against Tomorrow, and The Mayor's Tongue. He is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine and a regular contributor to The Atlantic and the New York Review of Books. He lives in New Orleans. We're very happy to have him here in Los Angeles. Jane Smiley is the author of many books for adults, including Some Luck, Horse Heaven, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning 1,000 Acres. She was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2001. Saddles and Secrets is the second book in the Ellen and Ned trilogy, right after Writing Lessons. Jane is also the author of five Horses of Oak Valley Ranch books: The Georges and the Jewels, A Good Horse, True Blue, Pie in the Sky, and Gee Whiz. She lives in Northern California, where she rides horses every chance she gets. Please welcome Nathaniel and Jane.
Hello. Thank you for coming out.
Yeah.
I hope I don't
Seconded.
have anything to say.
Yeah, you assured me that you would do all the talking before.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's really great to be here with you all. Thanks for coming out. I know how hard it is to come out in Los Angeles for anything, so I'm honored. And it's really an honor to be here with Jane Smiley, a writer, novelist I admire so deeply. And so I've been really excited for this this event. And it's also a thrill for me to be back in the store. I came here for the first time when my first novel was published 11 years ago. And so it's very special for me to come back. And so I'm going to read a short passage. This is from this book, Losing Earth. I'm not going to really talk about it because we'll have time to talk about it.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk.
Yeah, okay. This is just from close to the beginning. It's introducing one of the main characters, James Hansen, NASA scientist who would become the face of climate science internationally, and this is him and his wife. In the living room of James and Anique Hansen, under a bright window giving out to Morningside Park, there's a brown velvet love seat that nobody ever sat in. Eric, their 2-year-old son, was forbidden to go near it. The ceiling above the couch sagged ominously, as if pregnant with some alien life form, and the bulge grew with each passing week. Jim promised Anique that he would fix it, which was only fair because it had been on his insistence that they gave up the prospect of a pre-war apartment in Spoiden-Dival, overlooking the Hudson River, and moved to this 2-story walk-up with crumbling walls, police siren lullabies, and gravid ceiling. Jim had resented the commute to the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in Manhattan, complaining that such a profligate waste of his time, 45 minutes each way, would soon be unsustainable once the Pioneer spacecraft reached Venus and began to beam back data. But despite living within a few blocks of his office, Jim couldn't find time for the ceiling, and after 4 months it finally burst, releasing a confetti of browned pipes and splintered wood. That was April. Jim repeated his vow to fix the ceiling the next time he had a spare moment. That would come, according to his calculations, on Thanksgiving Day. Anique held him to his word, though it meant that she had to live with a hole in her living room ceiling for 7 months, 7 months of plaster and dust powdering the love seat. Another promise Jim made to Anique: he would be home for dinner every night by 7 o'clock. By 8:30, however, he was back to his mathematical preoccupations. Anique didn't begrudge him his deep commitment to his research. It was one of the things she loved about him. Still, it baffled her that the subject of his obsession should be the atmospheric conditions of a planet more than 24 million miles away. It baffled Jim, too, when he came to think about it. How he traveled to Venus from Denison, Iowa, where he'd been the youngest child of a diner waitress and an itinerant farmer turned bartender, was a mystery, the outcome of a series of bizarre twists of fate for which he claimed no agency. was just something that had happened to him. Hansen figured he was the only NASA scientist who, as a child, did not dream of outer space. He dreamed only of baseball. On clear nights, his transistor radio picked up the broadcast of the Kansas City Blues, the New York Yankees' AAA affiliate. Every morning, he cut the box scores out of the Omaha World Herald, for which he served as chief denizen delivery boy from third grade through high school, pasted them into a notebook, and tallied statistics. In a childhood of deprivation and meagerness, during his earliest years, he shared 2 rooms with 6 siblings in homes that lacked running water and a refrigerator. Hansen found comfort in numbers. He majored in math and physics at the University of Iowa, but he never would have taken an interest in celestial matters were it not for the unlikely coincidence of 2 events during his graduation year, the eruption of a volcano in Bali and a total eclipse of the moon. On the penultimate night of 1963, whipping wind, 12 below, Hansen accompanied his astronomy professor to a cornfield miles outside of town. They set a telescope in an old corn crib that Hansen shortly discovered was being used as shelter by every beetle, fly, and wasp from the surrounding 40 acres. Between 2 and 8 o'clock in the morning, Hansen made continuous photoelectric recordings of the eclipse, pausing only when the extension cord froze and when he had to race to the car to avoid frostbite. During an eclipse, the moon resembles a tangerine, or if the eclipse is total, a drop of blood. But this night, to the consternation of Hansen's professor, the moon vanished altogether. Hansen made the mystery the subject of his master's thesis, concluding that the moon had been obscured by the dust erupted into the atmosphere by Mount Agung on the other side of the planet from his corn crib 6 months earlier. The discovery stirred in him a fascination with the influence of invisible particles on the visible world. You couldn't make sense of the visible world, he realized, until you understood the whimsies of the invisible one. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think, I'm sure that one of the reasons that you decided to write this was that everybody in every character was an interesting person. Every person that you focused on and paid attention to, they were like characters in novels. And I think that is one of the great things about this book, is that you just, yes, we're all interested in the climate issue. We're all interested in what happened and where it went. But following each individual person is really interesting.
Yeah, I was really interested in the characters, and I didn't know that would be the case when I started researching a piece about a bunch of scientists and policy, wonks, basically. But what was so exciting to me about people like even Hansen, who's this genius scientist, and certainly Rafe Pomerantz, who's the other main figure, who is a activist and kind of political lobbyist, is that they came to the issue just like all of us do, I think, when we first come to terms with this question of global warming and everything that will lead to. And their responses were also, I think, the same ones that we all have, which is essentially, holy shit, surely this is not as bad as it seems. Mm-hmm. Surely if it's this bad, somebody's dealing with it. And over the course of this decade, I think they go through, it's very intuitive to me, the choices they make. It's sort of what I think most of us would do. I mean, I think of the beginning, certainly, it's like the scene at the beginning of any disaster movie where the scientist leaps up from the desk and fixes his spectacles and says like, oh my God, that's not a meteor, that's an alien spaceship coming, and he runs to the Joint Chief of Staff and alerts them and says, and that's basically what they do, and they run to in the power corridors of Capitol Hill and they try to get people's attention.
Well, that makes me wonder. So, at what point? How old were you when it suddenly struck you, and when you suddenly said, "Oh, God, what is going on here?"
That's a good question. I mean, I think, I guess there's sort of I remember learning about the issue when I was a kid, during this period, I think, in the late 80s. But yeah, when did
they were teaching it in school?
Well, I remember learning about recycling when I was 9. And feeling that was really important. Mm-hmm. And I remember a little bit about the ozone hole and how scary that was, and the idea of the sun blasting through the atmosphere and causing blindness, as it was feared. And but no, I think thinking about it in personal terms, I think probably maybe not until I was into my late 20s, early 30s, and I think I still I go through phases where I put it totally out of my mind, and other phases where I become obsessed about it. And I think that in some ways is maybe the only human response, is to alternate between sort of blithe optimism and despair, and it's sort of a muddle, I think.
So do you feel that that's what that's what your characters have done too? I mean, Rafe Pomerantz and Hansen. Do you think they too have sort of alternated between despair and
I think they've been more. Well, Rafe is an interesting case. I mean, when he first discovers this issue, he's sitting in his office, 1979. He's 32, and he reads this obscure government report that mentions in passing on page 66 that oh, and by the way, if we continue to burn fossil fuels, the world will end, basically. And his wife is 7 months pregnant at the time. My wife is currently 7 months pregnant, and he has this conversation with her that I think is now something I've heard talking about this book. I hear it all the time, almost every night on this tour. Is he says, "Well, is this really a good idea to have children? Is this wise? Have we made a mistake?" And so he's going through the same kind of personal crises that I think people are increasingly going through now, but he was just there 40 years earlier. And it was, and so I think it's, for me, telling the story of these people is also trying to tell the story of how this great public crisis is touching our own personal lives in all kinds of ways, some of which we're not even conscious of.
I'm old enough to be your mom, and and when you get to be my age, your kids start telling you what to do, as most of you know. And when I express my worries about these issues, my kids kind of say, "Oh, we'll take care of it."
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you think that's true?
When did you become concerned about it, or are you concerned about it?
Oh, I became concerned about it in 1988.
Oh.
When there was a big heat wave, and that's when I first learned about. And there was a big fire. That was the Yellowstone fire, and actually in the trilogy, the series of books that I wrote, I put in a woman, a young girl, who becomes obsessed because of the fires, and that's probably when I first paid attention. In 88, and I was living in Iowa, and it was and we knew about Hansen because he was from Iowa.
Right, and you could see the fires in Chicago. I think there was something you could see some of the smoke.
Well, they said that.
Yeah.
They said that. I mean, it's really interesting how far the smoke and the dust actually get when things are really going wrong, and maybe that's what people need to alert them.
Yeah, and why as an Iowan and an expert on all things Iowa, why are all of these great astrophysicists, why do they all come out of Iowa? I never figured that out.
Because they can see the stars and there's no smog.
Right. Okay. That
I
makes
guess
sense.
I don't know.
Well, because Hansen, I mean, this Hansen is such an interesting figure to me, because he really firmly says, like, I didn't care about. Not only did he not care about climate science, but he didn't even care about outer space. And the only reason he went down this route was he happened to be at the University of Iowa with this famous physicist, James Van Allen, who was from another farm town not far away and was teaching at the school. And he essentially he was the author of the whole strategy to put a man on the moon. And also, the Van Allen belt is named for, and he's this significant major figure, and he had come back to Iowa, I also don't really know that, to teach at the University of Iowa, and Hansen happened to be a student, and he was sort of directionless, and Van Allen said, "Well, why don't you study the climate of Venus?" And he said, "Sure."
Well,
and then he went down this path and became the world's most famous climate scientist.
One of the things I think is fascinating is how these little connections, just these little happenstances happen. So the guy I wrote a book about the invention of the computer, and the guy who invented the computer, he happened to come to Iowa State because Harvard was too late sending their acceptance of his employment. And then he happened to invent the computer at Iowa State because there was an engineering school and he could get a student to put the machine together. Whereas for Alan Turing at Cambridge, there was nobody around to put the machine together. So he couldn't do the engineering side of it.
Right.
So a lot of ways, all the things we know are about the world that we live in have to do with just these weird
Iowa. Come from
Well, I
Iowa.
wouldn't say that, but just these weird chances that things happened.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. And that's a great book. I highly recommend to everyone. Man who
thanks.
invented the computer.
Yeah, thank you.
I think also and sort of novelistic nonfiction work about scientists. And I was looking for those when I was working on this. I didn't find many other
Oh, really?
examples.
Huh.
Yeah.
So as you were working on it, did you find yourself becoming angry, more angry, or were you able to handle that somehow?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
let
a
me
good
explain
question.
a little
Yes,
bit.
yeah.
So what Nathaniel does is he follows the issue of climate change from when it first became a known political issue. And everybody in the government said, oh yeah, we need to deal with this, we need to deal with this. And then, boom, Reagan came into office, bringing John Sununu with him. And suddenly the opposition, which he talks about in some detail, suddenly the opposition decided, why bother? And so essentially we're screwed, or we could be screwed, in a way that we wouldn't have been if they'd actually stuck with their original ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that struck me is, I found, and so I was doing a lot of research. I went to National Archives. I ended up interviewing more than 100 people who were in these policy circles around Washington and trying to solve this thing. And I read every newspaper article, and I in the archives I found this incredible document, and this is sort of one opened up the story for me, which has never been reported on. And I just came across it. And it was a meeting held 4 days before the election that Reagan would win, so at the end of Carter's term. And despite some setbacks, Pomerantz and Hansen and others had by then been able to get Congress to pay attention. There had been the first hearings about the issue, 1980-81. Al Gore in the House led some hearings when he was just a junior congressman from Tennessee. And this congressional air study group basically said, okay, let's get the 30 experts of the world on this subject together in a room and tell us what kind of laws we need to pass to fix this thing. And for no really good reason, they pick as a venue this crazy resort hotel in Florida, right on the Gulf, the Pink Palace, Hotel Don Cesar, which is like where F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda would go to cool off after benders, and Al Capone would hide out, and Babe Ruth also to cool off of benders, and so they go to this insane resort, and it's beautiful outside, and these 30 experts get together, and Rafe is one of them, and so is a scientist from Exxon who's been studying it, and all kinds of politicians and so on, and they all agree on the science. They all agree that it's a problem. They all agree that it's their responsibility to act. And basically, at the time, they think they're going to solve this thing, 1980-81. And they cannot agree on a single sentence, let alone policy recommendation, because they're all full of sort of self-doubt, scientific language. They can't agree on any terminology, and that it's almost a comic scene. And there was a transcript of this meeting. It's like 600 pages. It's a conference over the course of 3 days, and it reads almost like a play. It's like 30 angry men, basically. And it just starts off really optimistic and exciting, and they're just full of energy. And by the end, they just all hate each other and are furious. And there was like one woman there who's a doctor who's there as sort of representing the congressional group. And she essentially almost bursts into tears at the end of it. And she says, "This is crazy. Like, we got you into this room together so that you could try to solve, you all agree. Why can't you just write, just a statement?" And they sort of go on their own, each one goes on their own sort of, hobby horse, and they never can do it. And that to me is in some ways encapsulates the whole story of how tricky this is to solve, even when everyone's on the same page. But then, of course, yes, by the end of the decade, after this is elevated to the level of national policy, you have a global treaty is seen as a solution and starts to be negotiated. You have this dark hat of villain of John Sununu comes in, who's essentially the patient zero of climate denial, and he has his own pet theories about. He's the first person to really question the science in a serious way, and he also has these conspiratorial theories about leftist forces using the science to destroy the economy. And single-handedly, through this power fight within the White House, he manages to force the U.S. to withdraw from any kind of agreement. And so it's, in some ways, it's almost like a black comedy if it wasn't so tragic at the same time.
So as you were writing about these people, what kept you from tearing your hair out?
Oh, I mean, I think it's. I guess it's how I feel about any piece of writing, where even if the subject matter is dark or upsetting, the process of writing is exciting and fulfilling. And so, I was thinking about narrative and structure, but yeah, I mean, it was at times, when I stop to think about it, it does seem fairly insane. And there are moments like I interviewed John Sununu at length, and I said at one point, so let me get this straight. Like, you're single-handedly responsible for stopping any chance at solving climate change on the planet? And he sort of was like, well, he basically said, like, that's kind of you. I'd like to take credit, because he still denies the science. But I wish I could boast that. But in fact, I felt that the U.S. was being the only honest broker in this international negotiation over this treaty, because he didn't think that even if they had signed this global treaty, that the other countries would live up to the terms of it, which is sort of another debate that could be had. I disagree, but it is, when you zoom out, it's easy to talk about the failures of capitalism or of U.S. democracy, of our institutions. And yet, when you go closer, you realize it's a bunch of people in a room arguing, and each with their own craziness, and it's sort of the oldest human story there is.
One of the things I noticed when I was reading it, and I read it twice, but one of the things I noticed was that your tone is not particularly dark, and that makes the book easy to read and easy to understand, because you're so interested in the people. You're knowledgeable about the issues, but you're interested in how everything plays out. And so the reader just sort of moves along, taking it in. And in some ways, I wasn't as shocked as I wanted to be. I have to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much writing on this subject understandably comes from outrage and frustration, and at this point bitterness and anger that we haven't solved it yet, and that there has been all this failure. And I think that's valuable. I think there's something very valuable with that kind of writing. But I also think there's something valuable about a story about people making decisions and struggling with these larger questions about, how is this affecting the way we live? How is this affecting the way we think of the future? how is this making us question our own identity, the identity of our democracy, that if we can't act on this very fundamental issue, how can we really say we believe in all the fundamental values that we hold as the central, the pillars of our democracy, of our civilization?
That's a very good question.
And I feel like that kind of, those questions haven't really been posed in the literature on the subject, and I felt that that's where I could try to make a contribution more, just to ask some of those questions as more than adding to the pile of here are the policies that we need to enact next year.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another question. So I've been reading Odds Against Tomorrow, which was your second book, right? And that's from 2013. And the protagonist is a very interesting guy named Mitchell, who begins his life and spends his whole life thinking about horrible things that might happen either tomorrow or 10 years from now, but a whole list of them. And is he based on you? Are you like him? Or is he just somebody that you saw from a distance and thought was interesting?
It's very funny because I got a version of that question yesterday from someone named Mitchell, who was born in Overland Park, the suburb where Mitchell Zucker is from, and he's a risk analyst like Mitchell, but he was something close. And he wrote me, and out of the blue, I got this email. He said, "Did you base your character on me?" And he was like, "Just joking, but not really." I was like, he's in part based on someone I know, but loosely enough that person, a friend from college, doesn't know that I did it, even though his middle name is Mitchell. I just never made the connection. But it's also, it's a character who's obsessed about worst case scenarios, and he gets what seems to be his dream job, which is to predict worst case scenarios as this risk analyst on Wall Street, and begins to profit off of it. And then one of his scenarios actually comes to pass, which is a hurricane hits New York, and there was this odd coincidence of writing a novel about a hurricane hitting New York and flooding, and then it was published like a couple months after Sandy actually hit New York and flooded.
It really struck me because when I knew that I had to end my trilogy in 2020, even though I finished writing it in 2014.
Right.
So I had to do something I'd never done before, which was to try and come up with dystopian science fiction.
Uh-huh.
And when I finally did it and published it and then looked back at it, I realized, no, it was not dystopian enough. I should have called you.
Well, I think writing about the near future is like one of the hardest things because you're so frightened that something you write will happen or...
No, I was frightened it wasn't
going to happen. You just suppressed your anxiety to write. Yeah. I was convinced every year that a hurricane was going to hit New York and I'd have to throw out the novel. And then it did hit New York, but as bad as it wasn't. Struggle to talk about this in a way that doesn't sound hideous, but as bad as it was, it wasn't so bad that publishing a novel would be in bad taste. It wouldn't be like publishing a terrorism novel in December of 2001. So it was just bad enough that made people think that I was writing a documentary that was somehow about Sandy, but not bad enough that they had to cancel the book. But no, I think Mitchell. I think he has a lot of. I share a lot of those anxieties about the future, and it's not just about climate change, but it allowed me to take it to these logical but extremes, and that was really fun. And I think if anything, it was a kind of exorcism of some of those fears.
Is that right? So it worked.
Because I think as self-therapy. I mean, because once you take everything, once you really stare at the worst case scenarios and anxieties about the future, it has a kind of leveling effect, and it forces you to become kind of zen about it, I think.
Well, I'm not going to give away the ending of this, but I will say that it's a little more positive than I expected it to be. I mean, the whole time I was reading it, I said, okay, what's he going to say at the end? What's he going to say at the end? And I got there, and I thought, Oh, that's a little more positive than I expected.
Yeah,
And
well, they didn't solve global warming.
not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the piece. I mean, it started as a piece in the New York Times Magazine, and there was a brief afterward that my editors really wanted me to write. That was essentially, well, what do we make of all of this? And I was resistant of writing, so I had something, but it was sort of gestural. And then when the piece came out, that was that was the resounding response was, well, what do we make of this? What do we make of this failure? What are we, And so I did feel some obligation to try to answer that in greater depth. And it's not that I have the answers exactly, but I do feel that it opens up the conversation. It's a way of opening up the conversation to sort of a deeper level, and to discuss the human dimension of it a bit more broadly. And so that's.
Okay, so are we ready to open up the
Sure,
conversation?
yeah.
And discuss the human element?
The human element, yeah.
Yeah, if a doctor can be sued for malpractice, why can't a politician, or can he or she?
Can a politician be sued for? I think that's voting. I guess you throw them out of the
Well,
office.
there are suits that are happening now about endangerment.
Yes, in fact, tomorrow night I'm doing an event in Portland with a lawyer from our Children's Trust, which is this incredible lawsuit that has 21 child plaintiffs, including James Hansen's granddaughter, and Hansen's working on the case. And it's one of a number of major legal cases that are trying to set legal precedent, basically, on climate change. And the theory is they're suing the government and saying that by failing to address this problem, and the government's known about it from at least the 1950s. It's not just 1979. 79 is very solid scientific consensus in the beginning of action, but Lyndon Johnson, was briefed on it, and so on. So they have the whole history, and so they're suing the government, and the idea is that the government has, I forget exactly the constitutional clause, but that it's prevented the plaintiffs from having it's infringing on their basic right to liberty and security and other rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. And that lawsuit has actually cleared some hurdles. And along the way, it was filed under Obama, and when it was filed, the oil and gas industry, particularly American Petroleum Institute, which I write about in the book, which has sort of shaped this whole narrative about denial and this whole propaganda effort that's been going on for decades. API didn't trust Obama, the administration, to defend the case well, so they joined the suit. And so then when they joined the suit, the lawyer said, great, now we need discovery on all of your internal documents about climate change going back for 50 years. And then they tried to get out of the suit. And then Trump came in, and they tried to get out of it. And that legal fight is ongoing. They're doing some kind of a big march in June. But that's one version of this approach, and there's a million other cases against the oil and gas industry. So there are efforts to try to hold these companies and the government responsible. But I think it also begs the question, even if you were to have show trials of, Exxon executives and throw, the people at API into prison, or,
Take away all their money.
You still have to solve the problem. That would be good. Maybe that'd be healing. And and that's one of the mechanisms they are trying. Yeah. So people are trying that. Yeah.
It's been interesting to watch the Extinction Rebellion in England and
what do
how
you make of
huge
that?
it is.
Yeah.
And it's basically, as far as I can tell from reading The Guardian, it's basically young people saying the same thing. You've screwed us, and we're going to make you pay.
Yeah.
And I certainly hope they do.
Well, there's been a profound shift, I think, in the last 6 months, just in the conversation. I mean, basically, the activist line that originates with Hansen and with Pomerantz in 1979 is an appeal to reason. It's saying that we have the science, we know what to do, and it's silly not to act. and we better act soon. And you hear that in 1979, you hear it in 1988 from James Hansen, you hear it from Al Gore in Convenient Truth. It's just, now we have even more science, even more data. We have pictures and graphs. And that's been the argument until, I think, really the midterm election, when you have the emergence of the Sunrise Movement, the Green New Deal folks, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist, and they're making a different case. They're saying, they say, yes, the science is real, et cetera, but the emphasis is on you are harming us. You're in action, speaking usually to older politicians and in industry. You're stealing our future away from us. You are killing us. This is unjust. This is a crime. It's a moral language, and I think it's had a major effect on the public conversation. Whether that's enough to change things, we'll see.
I recently read Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and he talks a lot about kind of the danger of incomplete or false narratives. So, as much as I'm not going to dispute the gravity of climate change and the science behind it, I'm curious if while you were doing your research, what are the technologies or the solutions that might not necessarily be government interventions that could potentially be promising that we're not hearing about? Like, is there more potential hope for us than we're hearing about?
Yeah, I think the big picture view is something like James Hansen told me is, we have the technology to keep warming within, even 1.5 degrees above historic averages. We have the technology, the economics are there in a way they weren't 40 years ago. It's very clear that this is good on the whole for global economy, for national economy to make this transition from fossil fuels, but we're lacking political will. William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel for in economics recently and was the author of basically carbon pricing, started working on this in the mid-'70s, says the same thing. It's the solutions are out there. They tend to be the same grab bag. I mean, James Hansen has his own plan. That's a 12-year plan that starts, not coincidentally, like the day Trump's first term ends, we'll see. The strategy banks on him not winning, I guess I should say. But it's some combination of carbon pricing, more investment in renewables, investment in decarbonization technology, which is still very speculative, better agricultural practices, and some mitigation. Nuclear. Hansen's a big proponent of nuclear, which is more controversial. So there are a million of these roadmaps that are out there. The technology's there, and so the question is, how do you move these political bodies? Yeah. Hey.
My question is about developing population centers with big population, less industry. So how would you say the outcome of India getting their industrialization right, how does it rank in importance to what policies might happen here, or what's presently already happening in China, but obviously
Yeah, high priority, and I think India will be, but projections have it, being number 2 or number 1 in the next few decades, and and if nothing's done, most of that new energy consumption is coal, and it's a disaster for the planet. And James Hansen's solution, which is again very controversial, is basically to export nuclear technology to all of the developing world. That's not the only way of doing it.
What if the U.S. finally got its act together, but India
was all coal? And this is a problem they're talking about in 1978 and 79 as well, how to handle that. And part of what's changed is it's now cheaper in many cases, if not most cases, to do solar and wind instead of opening a coal plant or even a gas plant. But yeah, it's the level of policy and work that's required is gargantuan. It has to be organized and it has to be done well. There are ways of doing it, but one of the most treacherous things about denialism and this whole campaign is not only to sow public ignorance and to politicize the issue, but to put off reasonable debates that could happen about climate policy. What's the best way to help India, and modernize or just even escape horrific poverty. without destroying the planet. And you could imagine in a healthy democracy there might be different views about what are the best paths, but we don't even get into those conversations yet because we have a party that doesn't even.
Well, I have concerning that, I have a question. So did you interview any true, dedicated denialists?
Yeah, well, Sununu is.
But I mean people like the Koch brothers.
Oh, well, I didn't have to interview a lot of, I had the luxury, most people who write about this issue today, the deniers won't really talk to them. And I was talking to the people who created those strategies originally in the 80s, and they're mostly retired now, or perversely, they're like green consultant, like the head of the API environment group who figured out the strategy that became morphed into denialism.
Does he have any shame?
No shame. He's really proud of the book. It's really confusing. He came to the Washington event, and he sat next to me and Rafe Pomerantz. I did the event with Rafe Pomerantz, and this guy was sitting next to me, and he was very proud of the book and excited. We took a picture together, and he's like a nice guy, and he worked. He worked under Reagan on ozone and CO2. He helped broker an agreement between Reagan and Gorbachev to address climate change in 1986. And yet at API, he authored this strategy of, the first version of it was, we need to engage in the political debate, because it seemed at the time that some kind of climate legislation was inevitable. We need to be an active participant. We need to make sure that no policy goes beyond the science. We need to emphasize uncertainty in the science where it exists, which is very different from saying that the whole science is uncertain.
Yeah.
And then the key thing was we won't endorse any policy that affects the bottom line of the industry. And that's the beginning. And under him, the PR campaign of getting some scientists to say that there's not consensus and paying them begins. And then that part of it is so successful in changing the public narrative that ends up being where all their efforts are focused.
These are the people I don't understand, who can look at the world that they themselves are destroying and say, oh, I did a good job.
Yeah, I think he wasn't there when it went into the full delirium of denialism. So I think he distinguishes, he makes that distinction.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally, Sununu is interesting to me because I think he really is sincere about his theories. I don't think most national Republicans who say, well, maybe the climate's changing, but I don't think man is responsible. That stuff I don't believe I think the most charitable interpretation is they're ignorant, or maybe like a Rick Perry figure, but for the most part, I think they're just, towing the line. Yeah.
Stop, back right there.
Based upon all the research that you did, and considering this began as an article as opposed to a book, was it hard to condense all of the stuff that felt like it needed to be said into so many words?
Yeah, it was. I cut a third for the article. I was able to expand it a bit. There's a lot of information I wanted to include that, despite the length of the article, which was like 30,000 words, I couldn't fit in. But in some sense, the first version was this master, extremely boring version that had everything in it. So as difficult as it was also, I knew it was you couldn't add 20 more meetings or congressional hearing. It was just deadening. So the tricky thing was figuring out which ones to emphasize and dwell in. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. What is the relationship between global warming and possible volcanic activity contributing to it, or contributing to the mitigation of it? And on top of that, can global warming possibly trigger volcanic activity?
Well, this was Hansen's early research, and it was volcanic dust acting as a counterbalancing CO2 and actually having a cooling effect on the planet. And that idea is behind some of these geoengineering theories of seeding the clouds with sulfur and cooling the atmosphere artificially. But everyone's pretty scared about that because seems like a lot could go wrong if you start to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I picked up doing fresh air with Terry Gross. It's like when you know you're gonna need it in your chosen field. I was just wondering, like, what was that experience like for you? How did that go? Like, were you nerve-wracked about it? Did she ask questions that were surprising?
Yeah, I was interviewed by Terry Gross. It was really stressful. It was not in person. I was just in a studio in New Orleans, and the interview was also, I found, really weird because it was a lot of questions just about like Trump and climate change, and less about there was some about the history, but it wasn't in the depth that I expected. But then they edited it all together, and I think it ends up sounding really good. But it was at an angle that I wasn't prepared for, so that added to my anxiety. General anxiety about it not being articulate.
She's a pretty aggressive interviewer, and if you're not used to that, it can sort of take you back.
Yeah, and she was aggressive. She was just aggressive about things that were not what I expected her to be aggressive about. So it's just like
She's
it was at an
she's
angle.
pretty old style.
Yeah,
as an interviewer.
you've had your experience.
Yeah, one time. Yeah.
What was your experience like?
I thought she was very hostile, and then I listened to the interview, and it didn't sound hostile
She
at all.
probably retaped her.
It was just something about her demeanor.
Yeah,
that was
she
strange.
had this whole long thing, and I haven't even listened to the interview because the whole thing was too stressful. But I don't know if it made it. But she had this she's like building an argument about how we really couldn't have solved global warming in this period, and it's not even like that's not really the argument of the book. So it's like okay, you could make that argument. I could give you some more evidence for why. Maybe Sununu was right that it wouldn't have, but that's not really the point of the.
Right.
So anyway, but that's getting in the weeds. She did a great job.
Can you talk about a couple of maybe the more surprising or shocking things you've uncovered?
Well, I mean, the most shocking thing was just, there's no conversation we have about the issue, including the most speculative, geoengineering ideas or developing world or, responsibility of U.S. leadership. Everything that we talk about today, you can find basically in the transcript from the Pink Palace meeting, and so the fact that so much of the conversation not only didn't seem dated, but seemed in many ways often more advanced than the level of now I feel like, and I think it's a byproduct of the denialism thing, we speak about the issue in a really childish way. Like, are we going to beat this thing, or are we going to die? Like, are we, is it possible or is it not possible? Is it, should we be hopeful or should we be fearful? And it's like, how can we be a little more adult about the issue? And especially the thing which has been a big conversation in the activist community over the last number of years is like, what's the best way to motivate people to care? And there's the trend is that, we need to make people feel excited and hopeful about all the good things that are going on, because if they're not, they'll tune it out and they won't act. And it's like, I don't think a lot of the countries that are way further along in the policy and technology than us, like in Scandinavia or like Germany, I don't think they're particularly hopeful. Like, it's not how they, it's like it's very American. And I think we've been stymied in a lot of ways. And gone backwards in the conversation, and so it made that clear to me, reading that they were talking about it in a more sophisticated way in 1980. But even another example of that, and I was listening, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has done more for the issue nationally probably than anybody else. Last week, 2 weeks ago, she was giving this impassioned speech on the floor of Congress saying, making this moral argument, if we don't act, we'll have blood on our hands. And then at the end, and it's this wonderful speech, and then at the end she's like, the government has known about this since 1989. And I was like, you're 40 years off. It's like, so even the people who are leading on the issue it's like they're still in the industry narrative of like, this is a new, and of course the basic science of climate change goes back to the 19th century. Anyway, so things like that are just...
Well, those are the things that you make clear in here. I think that makes it really interesting and worth reading.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, yes, sorry, one more.
What strategies do you think, or what projects or
Well, I mean, I think what's happening around the Green New Deal and sort of, I think the main thing is that as much as you might revile, the right or the National Republican Party, it's hard to see a pathway to any meaningful solution that it doesn't become bipartisan at some point, basically because of the Senate and the filibuster. So, on a very practical level, it doesn't matter. If Jay Inslee is running on climate, if he wins the presidency, if the Republican control of the Senate, or even more than 40 votes. And so, but I don't think the issue has to be partisan. And I don't think it's central, as central as it is to sort of the ideology of the National Party. I don't think it's central to most voters on the right in the way that maybe, abortion might be. And so I think it is more budgeable, and I think over history, when we've had sudden change on social issues leading to major legislation, it's usually accompanied by an appeal to a higher decency. And so I think that kind of language you see over and over again in the history of these things, and I think that's starting to happen now. And so I think it will have an effect, but yes, it's a question of scale and speed. I think we have to.
Well, I think it's time for you guys to buy your copy.
Thank you, Jane.
And let's thank Jane Smiley.
Thank you. It was lots of fun. Thank you.
Who also has books available?
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.